At 21, Lottie Dane was handed to a stranger the same way you'd hand someone a problem you no longer wanted to deal with. Her father didn't use those words, of course. He called it an arrangement. He called it an opportunity. He stood in the kitchen of their two-room house outside Harwick, Montana, and said it with the same flat voice he used when he announced the well had run dry or the mule had gone lame. Just another fact of life that needed managing. The man's name was Calvin Pratt. He had a homestead up in the Kessler Range, 40 minutes by wagon from the nearest town. He had 4 children ranging from 6 to 14, and he had just lost his wife to pneumonia the winter before. Lottie had met him exactly once at the grain exchange, where he'd looked her over the way a man looks at a wagon before he decides whether to buy it. She left on a Tuesday morning with 1 trunk and no promises. The road into the mountains was long and unpaved and deeply unkind. Calvin drove the wagon without speaking. Lottie sat beside him and watched the pines close in overhead and thought about every single thing she should have said to her father and didn't. The silence between her and Calvin wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind that said everything both of them were trying not to. The house appeared around a bend, a low, wide structure made of timber and hard decisions, with a porch that sagged on one end and a yard that hadn't been tended in months. 4 children stood on that porch. They did not wave. The oldest, a boy of about 14 with his father's flat expression already practiced into place, looked Lottie up and down and said nothing. The 3 girls behind him arranged themselves like a wall. Lottie stepped off the wagon. Nobody helped her with the trunk. She told herself that was fine. She told herself a lot of things in those first hours that she didn't quite believe. The boy's name was Tatum. The girls were Osie, Rue, and the youngest, 6-year-old Pearl, who had her dead mother's red hair and a way of staring at Lottie that made her feel like a ghost who hadn't figured out yet that she didn't belong there. Calvin showed Lottie the kitchen, the sleeping arrangements, and the woodpile. In that order. He told her meals were at 6 and again at noon. He told her the children had chores, and she was to see they did them. Then he walked out to the barn and left her standing in the kitchen, with 4 children watching her from the doorway like she was something that had wandered in from the cold. She asked if anyone was hungry. Tatum said they'd already eaten. They hadn't. She could tell from the empty pot and the way Pearl's eyes moved to the bread on the shelf, but she didn't say that. She just cut 4 slices and set them on the table and went to find where the butter was kept. That night, after the children were in bed and Calvin had retired without a word, Lottie sat at the kitchen table in the dark and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed. The house made sounds she didn't know yet. Wind in the eaves, something settling in the walls. Far off, the cry of something she couldn't name. She thought about her mother, who had died when Lottie was 12. She thought about how her mother had made anything feel like home just by moving through it, by touching the curtains, by humming while she worked, by knowing exactly where everything should go. Lottie had never learned how to do that. She'd never thought she'd need to. She was wrong. The first week was a war fought entirely without words. Tatum ignored every instruction she gave him. Osie, who was 11, did the work but made sure Lottie knew she resented it. Rue, 9, had a talent for disappearing precisely when there was something to be done. Only Pearl seemed curious about her, following at a careful distance, watching Lottie's hands when she kneaded dough or mended a hem. Lottie tried to be patient. She understood grief. She knew what it looked like when it wore the face of anger, because that's exactly what she'd done after her own mother died. Pushed everyone away and dared them to stay anyway. These children had lost their mother less than a year ago. Of course, they didn't want some woman their father had brought home in a wagon. Of course, they were trying to outlast her. She just had to make sure they couldn't. The trouble with Calvin was different. He wasn't unkind. He was simply absent. He fed his animals. He worked his land. He came in for meals and ate with the focused efficiency of a man refueling, and then he was gone again. He didn't ask Lottie anything about herself. He didn't explain anything about his life, his children, his expectations. Once, she caught him watching her from across the yard with an expression she couldn't read, and when she raised her hand in acknowledgement, he just looked away. She didn't know what she was to him. She wasn't sure he knew either. The 4th week, everything broke open. It started with Rue. Lottie had sent her to bring in water from the well before supper, a task she'd done a dozen times. But the sun went down and Rue didn't come back. Lottie waited. She waited longer than she should have because she kept thinking the girl had just stopped to play, just gotten distracted, just lost track of time the way 9-year-olds do. When the dark was fully down and there was still no Rue, Lottie grabbed the lantern and went out herself. She found her at the base of the ridge, 300 yards past the well, sitting on the ground with her ankle folded wrong beneath her, and her face white and tear-streaked and furious with the effort of not crying. "I didn't call out," Rue said, when Lottie reached her. Not explaining, not apologizing, just stating a fact. "I know," Lottie said. She set the lantern down and looked at the ankle. It wasn't broken, she'd seen broken, and this wasn't it. But it was badly twisted, already swelling against the boot leather. "Put your arm around my neck." Rue hesitated. "I'm not asking," Lottie said quietly. Not unkindly, but with a firmness she hadn't used before. Rue put her arm around Lottie's neck. Lottie carried her back to the house. Not easily. Rue was solid and the ground was uneven, and the lantern swung and threw shadows that made the footing treacherous. But she carried her all the way, and when she pushed open the kitchen door and Calvin looked up from where he'd just come in, she said only, "She twisted her ankle. I need cold water and cloth." He got them. He didn't ask questions. He watched Lottie wrap the ankle with a competence that clearly surprised him, and he watched Rue's face, which had gone from white to something softer, something uncertain, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Later, when Rue was settled and the house was quiet, Calvin appeared in the kitchen doorway while Lottie was washing the cloths. "She doesn't warm up easy," he said. "I know. She's like her mother that way." Lottie wrung out the cloth and didn't respond, because she understood he was telling her something important and she didn't want to step over it. "I appreciate you going out for her," he said. Then he was gone. Lottie stood at the basin for a long moment after he left. She thought about that sentence. She turned it over. She decided that for Calvin Pratt it was probably as close to thank you as he was going to get for a while, and that it was enough. For now it was enough. After that things shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way they do in stories where some grand gesture changes everything all at once. They shifted slowly, the way a frozen river shifts in March. You can't see it moving, but one morning you look, and something has given way. Rue started completing her chores without being told twice, then once, then without being told at all. Osie was harder. She was old enough to remember her mother clearly, and young enough that the memory was still raw and angry. She didn't want a replacement. Lottie understood that. She wasn't trying to be one. What she was trying to be was useful. What she was trying to be was present. She stayed up late helping Osie with the arithmetic she'd fallen behind on since her mother died, sitting at the table with the lamp between them and working through problems with a patience she hadn't known she had. Osie never thanked her, but she stopped leaving rooms when Lottie entered them, which felt like a kind of progress. Tatum was the last. He was 14 and he had taken on the shape of a man without yet having the heart of one, which made him both more and less difficult than the girls. He did his work. He didn't speak to Lottie if he could avoid it. He wasn't cruel, just deliberate in his absence, careful not to include her, careful to remind everyone, including himself, that she was temporary. Lottie let him. She couldn't force a boy of 14 to accept anything. All she could do was be there when he decided she was worth talking to. The deciding came in January, in the worst cold spell the Kessler Range had seen in 10 years. Calvin had gone to Harwick for supplies, a trip that should have taken 2 days, and stretched to 5 because a storm came down from the north and closed the roads. He'd sent word with a passing rider that he was weathered in at the livery and would be back when the road broke open. Lottie was alone on the homestead with 4 children and a woodpile that was going too fast. She rationed it. She moved everyone into the main room to sleep, hung blankets over the windows, kept the stove running only as much as they needed. Pearl slept curled against Lottie's side because it was warmest there, and Pearl had stopped caring about dignity somewhere around night 3. On the 4th night, Lottie woke to a sound she didn't recognize, a wet, labored breathing that wasn't sleep. She sat up in the dark and listened, and then she was across the room, kneeling beside the children's pallet, her hand on Pearl's forehead. The fever was high. Too high. The child was burning. Lottie moved fast. She woke Osie and told her to keep the stove going. She woke Tatum and told him to bring snow, clean snow, from the top of the pile by the north fence. He was out the door before she finished the sentence. She worked through the night with everything she had: cool cloths to bring the fever down, broth coaxed into Pearl between shivers, prayers that she hadn't spoken in years and didn't quite know she was saying. Tatum stayed up with her. He didn't say anything for most of it. He just did what she asked and stayed close and watched Pearl with an expression so raw that Lottie had to look away. Around 3 a.m, Pearl's breathing eased. The fever broke just before dawn. When Lottie sat back against the wall and closed her eyes for one moment, she felt something settle at the end of the pallet. She opened her eyes. Tatum was sitting there, watching Pearl sleep. "She's going to be fine," Lottie said. He nodded. His jaw was working. "You did good tonight," Lottie said. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he'd been careful not to for months. His eyes were red and tired and young. "Is she going to be okay?" "Yes, but we'll watch her tomorrow, and the day after." He nodded again. He didn't leave. They sat together in the dark until the light came, and Pearl slept, and the stove ticked, and the storm outside had nothing to say that mattered in that room. Calvin came back on the 6th day. He came through the door stamping snow from his boots and stopped when he saw Lottie's face. She told him about Pearl, the fever, the night, the breaking of it. She told it plainly, without drama. He listened the way he did everything, with complete stillness. Then he crossed the room to where Pearl was sitting up in the blankets, pale and small, and eating a bowl of broth, and he knelt down and pulled her against his chest. He held her there for a long time, Pearl's small fists bunched in his coat. When he finally stood, he looked at Lottie. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. What was in his face in that moment was something she'd been working toward for months without knowing it. Not gratitude exactly, but something deeper. Recognition. He was seeing her, maybe for the first time, as someone who had chosen to be here in every sense that mattered. That evening, after supper, he stayed at the table after the children had gone to bed. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her chair. She sat. "My sister thought this was a bad idea," he said. "Bringing someone in the way I did. Said it wasn't fair to you." Lottie wrapped her hands around the cup. She was right. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know another way. I know, I still don't," he said. "Know how to do this. Talk. Any of it. I've noticed." Something moved in his face. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm trying to say I'm sorry it started the way it did." Lottie looked at him, at the lines at the corners of his eyes, at the hands that had built this house and buried a wife and kept 4 children alive through seasons she hadn't been here for. She thought about all the ways she'd expected this to be harder than it was, and all the ways it had been harder than she'd expected, and how those weren't the same list. "We can start over," she said. "From where?" "From here," she said. "From right now. That's all we've got anyway." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. He picked up his coffee. "I don't know your middle name," he said. "June. Calvin August Pratt." "I know," she said. "You signed the paper." That time it was definitely a smile. Small and unused looking, like something that had been put away and forgotten. But there, spring came slowly that year, the way it always does in the mountains, not arriving so much as gradually asserting itself against the cold until the cold gave up. The yard came back. The garden went in. Lottie learned the names of the places Calvin loved. The bench on the north ridge where he went to think, the creek bend where the kids had always fished in summer, the elm at the property line that his father had planted 40 years before. She learned the names of things she hadn't thought to ask about. What Pearl was afraid of. Thunder, which made her small and clinging and easy to comfort. What Osie loved. Horses, which she was already better with than Tatum. What Rue needed, to be the one who figured things out herself. Not to be helped so much as to be trusted to get there. What Tatum carried, everything, all at once, all the time, as if someone had appointed him to hold the whole household up, and he'd said yes without being asked. She learned Calvin, too, in the slow way that honest things are learned. She learned that he woke before anyone else and stood on the porch with his coffee watching the light come. and that this was a private thing she wasn't supposed to notice, so she stopped noticing it. She learned that he was gentler with the animals than with people, not because he didn't care about people, but because animals didn't ask him to explain himself. She learned that when he disagreed with her, which happened because they were two people with two sets of opinions about everything from garden placement to bedtimes, he said so plainly and without cruelty and expected the same back then when she gave it. He listened in a way that men who'd been raised to think they didn't have to listen rarely managed. She learned slowly that what she'd been handed in that exchange outside the grain store wasn't a life she'd chosen, but it might become one. The day that settled it for her, the day she stopped counting exits and started thinking in terms of permanence, was in early May. She was hanging wash on the line when she heard wheels on the road and looked up to see a wagon coming down from the ridge. It was Margaret Pursley from Harwick, who ran the dry goods and knew everyone's business with the focused dedication of someone who considered it a public service. Margaret pulled up and regarded Lottie from the wagon's seat, with the particular expression of a woman who had decided something and wanted to see if the world would confirm it. "You're still here," she said. "I am," Lottie said. "I told them you wouldn't last the winter." Margaret said this without apology. She seemed to think of it as information. "A lot of people did," Lottie said. "You saved that little one. Pearl had a fever. She would have been fine regardless. Calvin doesn't think so." Margaret said it carefully, like she was putting something fragile down on a table. "He said as much at the grain exchange last month. Said you held that house together." She studied Lottie. "He's not a man who says things like that." "No," Lottie agreed. "He isn't." Margaret seemed to come to some internal resolution. "I was wrong about you," she said. "Just that." Then she clicked her tongue at the horse and drove on. Lottie stood there with a wet shirt in her hands watching the wagon go. The certainty that moved through her then wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet and settled and real, like water finding its level. She had not chosen this life, but she had lived it anyway, lived it honestly, fully, with everything she had, and in doing so it had become hers. When Calvin came in that evening, she was at the stove. He set his hat on the hook by the door, the way he always did, and she handed him a cup of coffee, the way she always did now, and for a moment they stood close in the small kitchen, and neither of them moved. "Margaret Pursley came by," Lottie said. "Did she?" She apologized. "First time for everything," he said. He was looking at her in the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, carefully, like he was trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. "Calvin," she said. "Yeah, I'm not going anywhere." He was very still for a moment. The house settled around them. Somewhere upstairs, Pearl said something and O.C. answered, and there was the sound of feet on boards and then laughter. Real laughter, the kind that doesn't know it's being listened to. "I know that now," he said. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the counter. "Just that." The stove ticked and the evening light came through the window, and the children laughed upstairs. And Lottie Dane, who had arrived in this house with one trunk and no promises, stood in the kitchen she had made her own and let herself believe it was true.